labor engaged in personal service industries from the realm of productive labor. If we have a function which, although in and for itself unproductive, is nevertheless a necessary moment of reproduction, then when this is transformed, through the division of labor, from the secondary activity of many into the exclusive activity of a few, into their special business, this does not change the character of the function itself. 49. If this is true of commercial travelers or bookkeepers, it obviously applies all the more to teachers or cleaning services. The definition of productive labor is commodity-producing labor, combining concrete and abstract labor, i.e. combining creation of use values and production of exchange values, logically excludes non-material goods from the sphere of value production. Furthermore, this conclusion is intimately bound up with a basic thesis of capital. Production is, for humanity, the necessary mediation between nature and society. There can be no production without concrete labor, no concrete labor without appropriation and transformation of material objects. So 48. See below, Chapter 6. Of the more systematic analyses of this problem, those of Nagels and Bischoff, see note 44 above, adopt a similar position to our own. Goff supports the opposite view, basing himself especially on a passage of Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. Page 644, in which Marx explicitly includes wage earners working for private capital, such as teachers, in the realm of productive labor. In our opinion, this passage, like several in theories of surplus value, only indicates that Marx had not yet completed his articulation of the contradictory determinants of productive labor. On the one hand, exchange against capital rather than revenue, and on the other, participation in the process of commodity production, which involves the unity and contradiction of the labor process and the valorization process, use value and exchange value, concrete and abstract labor. What is the immaterial good, produced by a wage-earning teacher, which could be conceptually contrasted with the immaterial service, produced by a wage-earning cleaner, working for a capitalist cleaning firm, or by a wage-earning clerk of a department store? 49. See below, page 209, 50. See Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. pp.283 ff. Jacques Governor attempts, mistakenly in our opinion, to transcend this limitation. In order to be able to include the production of immaterial goods by wage labor in the category of 44 introduction, this becomes evident when Marx sets forth in Capital Volume 2 his reasons for classifying the transport industry in the realm of the production of value and surplus value, rather than in that of circulation. The argument is clearly summarized in the following passage: the quantity of products is not increased by their transport. The change in their natural properties that may be effected by transport is also, certain exceptions apart, not an intended useful effect, but rather an unavoidable evil. But the use value of things is only realized in their consumption, and their consumption may make a change of location necessary, and thus, in addition, the additional production process of the transport industry. The productive capital invested in this industry thus adds value to the products transported. 51. Now it is obvious that none of these arguments is applicable to the carrying of persons. Passenger transport is not an indispensable condition of the realization of use values and adds no new value to any commodity. It is rather a personal service on which individuals, whether capitalists or workers, spend their own revenue. Thus, whether it is organized on the basis of wage labor or not, the passenger transport industry can no more be considered as increasing the total mass of social value and surplus value than can wage labor employed in the fields of commerce, banking, or insurance. In striking contrast to the above passage is Marx's argument in Chapter 6, 3, of Volume 2. While explicitly stating that transportation of persons by capitalist enterprise does not create commodities or use values of any kind, he notes that it is nevertheless a productive branch, even though that useful effect, Nutzeffekt, effect, is only consumable during the production process itself. 52. Ranging this question under the broader heading of so-called service industries, we may say that, as a general rule, all forms of wage labor which exteriorize themselves in and thus add value to a product, materials, are creative of surplus value and hence productive for capitalism as a whole. This applies not only to manufacturing and mining industries, but also to transportation of goods. S3. Public service industries such as the production and transport of water or any form of productive labor. He extends Marx's formulation referred to above into transformation of nature or the world, where, or the world means or society. Since wage-earning teachers transform society, without transforming nature, the implications are obvious. Jacques Governor, Le Travail Productif en Régime Capitaliste, Louvain, 1975, pp. 41 ft. 51. See below, pp. 226-7, 52. See below, pp. 134-5, 53. See below, Chapter 6. Introduction. 45. Energy, e.g. gas and electricity, the selling of meals in restaurants, the building and sale of houses and offices as well as provision of the material for constructing them, and of course agriculture. Many sectors which are often included under the heading service industries are, therefore, parts of material production and employ productive labor. By contrast, the letting of apartment or hotel rooms, the service of transporting persons in buses, underground systems or trains, the performance of medical, educational or recreational wage labor which is not objectivized outside the worker, the sale of specific forms of labor rather than of commodities, the work of commercial or banking clerks and of the employees of insurance companies or market research firms. These do not add to the sum total of social value and surplus value produced, and cannot therefore be categorized as forms of productive labor. An interesting illustration is provided by television. The production of television sets or films, including copies of such films, is obviously a form of commodity production, and wage labor engaged in it is productive labor. But the hiring out of completed films or the renting of a single television set to successive customers does not have the characteristics of productive labor. Similarly, wage labor employed in making advertising films is productive, whereas the cahoojing of potential clients to purchase or order such films is as unproductive as the labor of commercial representatives in general. The second problem is to draw a precise demarcation between the spheres of production and circulation in capitalist society as a whole. Volume 2 of Capital leaves no room for doubt about Marx's view. Only that labor which either adds to or is indispensable for the realization and conservation of a commodity's use value adds to the total amount of abstract social labor embodied in that commodity, is productive of value. Point 54. Like the rest of Volume 2, the passages dealing with this question are but successive unfoldings of the basic analysis of the commodity, of its irreducible duality and the contradictions flowing therefrom. Thirdly, we have to consider the different kinds of labor performed within the production process itself. Here Marx takes a much less simplistic attitude than some of his latter-day disciples. His fundamental doctrine is that of the collective laborer, as developed in Results of the Immediate Process of Production, 5. Productive Labor, 54. See below, pp. 225-6, 55. This text is included as an appendix in Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. See our introduction to this appendix, as well as Chapter 14 of Capita, Volume 1 itself. 46. Introduction is labor expended in the realm of production of commodities, as all wage labor indispensable for that production process. That is to say, not only manual labor, but also that of engineers, people working in laboratories, overseers, and even managers and stock clerks, insofar as the physical production of a commodity would be impossible without that labor. But wage labor which is indifferent to the specific use value of a commodity and which is performed only to extort the maximum surplus value from the workforce, e.g. the wage labor of timekeepers, or to assure the defense of private property, security guards in and around a factory, labor linked to the particular social and juridical forms of capitalist production, lawyers employed as salaried staff by manufacturing firms, financial bookkeepers, additional stock checkers made necessary by the tendency to overproduction. None of these is productive labor for capital. It does not add value to the commodities produced, although it may be essential to the overall functioning of the capitalist system, or of bourgeois society as a whole. The final case to be examined is that of petty commodity producers, independent peasants and handicraftsmen. While producing commodities and thus both use values and exchange values, these strata do not directly create surplus value, except in marginal cases, although they may contribute indirectly to the mass of social surplus value, for example, by depressing the value of food through their cheap labor. We believe that on this point Marx maintained the position put forward in Theories of Surplus Value. Such strata perform labor which is neither productive nor unproductive from the point of view of the capitalist mode of production, because they operate outside its framework. 56.7. Are unproductive laborers part of the proletariat? A precise definition of productive labor under capitalism is not only of theoretical importance. It also has major implications for social bookkeeping, calculation in value terms of the national income, 57, and significantly affects our analysis of social classes and the political conclusions we draw from it. 56. Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, Op. Cit. pp. 407-8, 57. It should be added that, for both analytical and practical reasons, it is quite legitimate for Marxists to introduce into calculations of national income a category such as total money incomes of all households and enterprises taken together, provided that it is clearly differentiated from the value of the annual product and incomes generated by annual production. Introduction 47. The narrowest position, which seeks to reduce the proletariat to the group of manual industrial workers, is in complete contradiction with Marx's explicit definition of productive labor, and we need not dwell on it here. At the other extreme, it is obviously absurd to extend the concept of the proletariat to all wage and salary earners without limitation, including army generals and managers earning $100,000 a year. The defining structural characteristic of the proletariat in Marx's analysis of capitalism is the socio-economic compulsion to sell one's labor power. Included in the proletariat, then, are not only manual industrial workers, but all unproductive wage laborers who are subject to the same fundamental constraints: non-ownership of means of production, lack of direct access to the means of livelihood, the land is by no means freely accessible, insufficient money to purchase the means of livelihood without more or less continuous sale of labor power. Thus, all those strata whose salary levels permit accumulation of capital in addition to a normal standard of living are excluded from the proletariat. Whether such accumulation actually takes place is in itself irrelevant, though monographs and statistics tend to confirm that, to a modest or sizable degree, this social group does engage in it. This is the case especially of the so-called managers, who, notwithstanding a platitude which continues to circulate in spite of all evidence to the contrary, are part and parcel of the capitalist class, if not necessarily of its top layer of billionaires. This definition of the proletariat, which includes the mass of unproductive wage earners, not only commercial clerks and lower government employees, but domestic servants as well, and which considers productive workers in industry as the proletarian vanguard only in the broadest sense of the word, has been challenged recently by several authors. 58 it was, however, undoubtedly the one advanced by Marx and Engels and their most orthodox followers, the mature, not the 58. Gilman groups the advertising managers, the directors of public relations, the legal counsel, the tax experts, the sales engineers, the legislative lobbyists, their clerical assistants together with the rest of the growing host of white-collar workers in the general category of third-party consumers. Although he does not explicitly say so, he thereby tends to exclude them from the proletariat. The Falling Rate of Profit, London, 1957, pp. 93 and 131. This view clearly influenced Paul Barron's analyses in The Political Economy of Growth, New York, 1957. And those of Barron and Paul Sweezy in Monopoly Capital, New York, 1966. Baccara et al. Le capitalisme monopoliste d'État, Paris, 1971, explicitly exclude the intermediate salaried layers from the proletariat, reducing the latter to the sole group of productive workers, workers producing surplus value. CPP 213 and 236 ff. 48 Introduction Senile, Kautsky, Plekhanov, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg et al. S9 But it raises a weighty objection. If only productive labor produces value and thereby reproduces the equivalent of its own wages, besides creating surplus value, 60 does this not imply that the wages of unproductive labor are paid out of surplus value produced by productive labor? And in that case, does there not arise a major conflict of interests between productive and unproductive labor, the first seeking to reduce surplus value to a minimum, the second wishing it to be increased? How can such a basic conflict of interest be reconciled with the inclusion of both sectors in the same social class? Furthermore, should the industrial workers not be opposed to any expansion of state expenditure, even in 59? The sources are too numerous to be listed exhaustively. The following are particularly worthy of note. Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. Page 798, where the unemployed, sick, disabled, mutilated, widowed, elderly, etc., are designated as the pauperized sections, Lazaruschichte, of the working class. Capital Volume 2, see below, page 516, where Marx defines the class of wage laborers as those who are under constant, continuous, compulsion to sell their labor power, on page 561 servants. Die Bedientenklasse are also characterized as wage laborers. Rosa Luxemburg, Einführung in die Nationalökonomie, Berlin, 1925, pp. 263-4 and 277-8, similarly includes casually and occasionally employed workers, as well as paupers, the sick and unemployed and so on as members of the working class. Trotsky, 1905, London, 1972, page 43, groups domestic servants under the same heading, and Kautsky, The Class Struggle, Erfurt Program, New York, 1971, pp. 35-43, explicitly includes in the ranks of the proletariat commercial and industrial wage earners. In his draft program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Plekhanov defines the proletariat as those who are forced to sell their labor power. See Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 6, page 19, later extending it to persons who possess no means of production and of circulation. All these persons are forced by their economic position to sell their labor power constantly or periodically, pp. 61-3. While Lenin contested the introduction of the words "and of circulation," he raised no essential objection to the formulation. 60. An interesting borderline case is that of the so-called semi-proletariat, the layer which retains partial ownership of its own means of production. Its income, which is derived from agricultural and handicraft commodities privately produced at a productivity of labor far below the social avenue age, barely exceeds its costs of production, and is therefore insufficient to secure the barest livelihood. The semi-proletariat is thus forced to work part of the time as wage labor. But precisely because it sells its labor power only temporarily, its wages can be driven far below the prevailing social minimum. Its social existence is characterized by a striking contradiction. While it is in no way involved in the extraction or consumption of surplus value, both its immediate and its historic interests stand in a certain limited opposition to those of the proletariat proper. That is why the semi-proletariat, unlike productive workers and other straightforward wage earners, cannot be regarded as a fraction of the proletariat. It represents rather a transitional phenomenon, with one foot in the petty bourgeoisie and another in the proletariat. Introduction 49 The realm of social services, since this is financed in the last analysis through an increase in surplus value extracted from them. This objection can be countered at two levels. To begin with, it is not true that all unproductive labor is paid out of currently produced surplus value. An important part of that labor, e.g. commercial employees, workers in the financial sector and those in unproductive service industries, is paid not out of currently produced surplus value, but out of that portion of social capital which is invested in these sectors. Only the profits of these capitals form part of currently produced surplus value. It is true that social capital is the result of past extortion of surplus value. But this applies also to variable capital, to wages currently paid out to productive workers. The important point here is that, Since wages and salaries in all these sectors are not drawn from currently produced surplus value, their payment in no way reduces the currently paid wages of productive workers. 61 Part of the wages bill of unproductive labor, however, is financed out of currently produced surplus value. This concerns essentially the wages and salaries of state employees in public services and administration, not, of course, the state industries, where autonomous commodity production and therefore value production occur. But in order to conclude from this that a reduction of state expenditure entails a reduction of surplus value and an increase in real wages, or, which amounts to the same thing, that the rise in state expenditure has occurred through an increase in surplus value and a reduction in real wages, it would be necessary to undertake a very detailed analysis of the trend of the rate of exploitation and of workers' living standards and needs since the explosion of state expenditure. Such an examination is clearly beyond the scope of this introduction, but two crucial points should be made. First, the concept of gross wages, wages before tax, has no meaning in Marxist economic theory. Wages are means of reconstituting the 61. These wages increase the total mass of social capital among which the given quantity of surplus value has had to be divided. In other words, they lower the average rate of profit. But as far as the industrialists are concerned, this is a lesser evil. If there were no autonomous commercial capital and commercial wage earners, their own capital outlays to cover the costs of circulation would be significantly higher, and the rate of profit still lower. See Capital Volume 3, Chapter 17. Since this only concerns the distribution of a given mass of surplus value between different forms of capital, with no direct bearing on the division of newly created value between wages and surplus value, on the rate of exploitation of productive labor, there arises no conflict of interest between productive and commercial wage earners. 50 Introduction Workers' labor power through the purchase of commodities and services. Thus money deducted from the worker's gross wage to help the state buy aeroplanes has nothing at all to do with wages. It is from the outset part of social surplus value. Of course, if fresh taxes actually lower previously attained levels of real wages, they may indeed be said to have increased the rate of surplus value. But again, this will be measured by comparing successive amounts of net real wages and not gross wages. Similarly, it would be absurd to construe state medical, educational or transport services which help reconstitute the worker's labor power, or maintain his family under normal living conditions, as derived from surplus value. They represent rather a socialized portion of the wage, regardless of whether it passes through the form of state revenue, and regardless of whether it originated in gross wages, taxes paid by the worker, gross profits, taxes paid by the capitalist, or the gross income of independent middle classes. 62 It thus proves meaningful after all to examine the impact of a rise or fall in state expenditure on average working class living standards, independently of its servicing, mediation, by unproductive state employees. Where these living standards decline, the conclusion is obvious: the total price of labor power, individual plus socialized wages, has been reduced. Where they rise, however, no sophism can prove that this entails an increase in social surplus value. To be sure, it could be accompanied by such an increase, but then so could a rise in real direct wages. Accompanied by is not synonymous with caused by, except for people with faulty logic. As Marxist economic theory rejects the notion of a rigid wages fund, 62. It has been objected that unemployment compensation can by no means be considered as the equivalent of the price, or value, of a commodity called labor power, for by definition the unemployed do not sell their labor power. However, this argument is based on a somewhat mechanistic reduction of the category, socialized wages. Nobody could assert that, if a worker places 10% of his current wages in a chocolate box or a bank account in order to provide for the portion of his active adult life, during which he expects to be unemployed, that amount of money thereby ceases to be part of his wages. There is no fundamental difference between this and the situation where all workers use a collective chocolate box or bank account called the National Institute of Unemployment Insurance or National Institute of Social Security, and where the sums of money do not pass through the workers' pay packets but are transferred directly from the capitalists' accounts to these institutes. Only if this analysis is accepted, by the way, is it legitimate to demand that such funds be exclusively administered by the unions, for neither the employers nor the state should have any say in how the workers spend their own money. Introduction 51 Any analysis of the effects of varying levels of state expenditure upon the rate of exploitation would have to be aggregate and dynamic. Nothing flows automatically from either the expansion or contraction of state expenditure. Thus, for it to be shown that it was rising at the expense of the working class, it would have to be proved that, under the given economic, social and political conditions, a reduction in expenditure would lead to higher real wages rather than higher profits for the capitalist class. Without such detailed proof, the thesis would remain doubtful, to say the least. The analysis would have to take into account the probable dynamic of the political and social class struggle, a function of, among other things, the great historical shifts in the economic correlation of class forces within a given bourgeois society, and its precise impact upon the structure of both state revenue and state expenditure. We seem to have strayed considerably from the problem of productive and unproductive labor, and its relation to the definition of the proletariat. But in reality, we have only now arrived at the heart of the problem. For the correct Marxist classification of the proletariat, the class which is forced by socio-economic compulsion to sell its labor power to the capitalist owners of the means of production, implies that both variations in the level of the reserve army of labor, and the variegated relations between the purely physiological and moral historical components of the value of labor power, 63, are of decisive importance for the proletarian's immediate destiny. Once we understand this, we can see the significance of the growth of unproductive wage labor, which accompanies the absolute and relative increase in the size of the proletariat in contemporary capitalist count rise. 64, far from reflecting increased exploitation of productive labor, or A63. See my introduction to Capital Volume 1, Op. Cit. pp. 66-72, and Late Capitalism, Op. Cit. pp. 149-58, 64.
Вашер Нерес, Инкель, Unemployed, as % of total active population 1930 s.
1974 Belgium.
65,2%, 1930.
83 feet 7% Canada.
66,7%, 1941. 89,2%.
France.
57,2%, 1936. 81,3%.
Germany 69, 7%, 1939. 84 feet 5%, West Germany, Italy.
51,6%, 1936. 72,6%.
Japan.
41%, 1936. 69,1%.
Sweden.
71%, 1940. 91,0%.
UK.
88,1%, 1931. 92,3%.
USA.
78,2%, 1939. 91,5%.
Sources. For the 1930s, Annuaire des Statistiques du Travail, 1945-6, Bureau International du Travail, Montreal, 1947. For 1974, Office Statistique des Communautés Européennes, Statistiques de base, 1976. 52 Introduction. Sharp rise in the rate of exploitation. It has rather established a ceiling above which the rate of exploitation can hardly climb under normal political circumstances, excluding, that is, fascist or fascist-type regimes. 4. Despite the rapid replacement of living labor by dead labor, semi-automated machinery, it is this growth of unproductive wage labor which, in many capitalist countries, has reduced the reserve army of labor for a whole historical period. Moreover, the services provided by a significant sector of unproductive wage labor have been a major factor in developing the needs and living conditions of the proletariat far beyond the purely physiological bedrock. The new minimum standard which has arisen is, at least in the imperialist countries, and in some of the most developed semi-colonial countries with a powerful labor movement, like Argentina, much higher than the one existing in Marx's time. This acquisition should obviously not be taken for granted or regarded as unassailable. It is nothing but a conquest made by the working class under favorable conditions on the labor market, long-term decline of structural unemployment, and rendered objectively possible by the long post-war period of accelerated economic growth. Sink. The early 70s, as was foreseeable, this basic economic situation has been reversed. 65 massive structural unemployment has reappeared, together with savage attacks in many rich countries on the real wages of the working class, be they aimed at direct or socialized wages or at both. Correctly, the workers have reacted strongly against massive cuts in social state expenditure, thereby showing that their class instinct is clearer than the science of those theoreticians who persist in calling all state expenditure surplus value, the logical consequence of which would be indifference to, or even approval of the cutbacks. 8. Luxury production, surplus value and accumulation of capital. Also related to the integration of Marx's labor theory of value with his theory of reproduction is the question of the exact nature of the labor which produces luxury goods, as well as its function in reproduction. This problem is important not so much because of the role of luxury consumption as such, but because of the obvious analogy between luxury products and another sector which has played an ominously 65. See Chapter 4 of Late Capitalism, Op. Cit. Introduction. 53 Growing role in capitalist economy ever since Marx wrote Capital. We are referring, of course, to arms production. Controversy over the exact function of the arms sector under capitalism has been raging since the end of the 19th century, when the Russian populist V. Vorontsov raised for the first time the possibility of avoiding crises of overproduction through absorption of part of surplus value by increased arms production. 66 In the 30s and 40s, a long debate among Marxists took up the role of rearmament in overcoming the long-term stagnation of the international capitalist economy during the interwar period. Since the war, the Vance Cliff-Kidron School has assigned a crucial position to the permanent arms economy, in the explanation of the long economic boom, and arms production occupies a central place in the process of surplus absorption, presented in Baron and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital. 67 More recently still, a new controversy has arisen between the author of this introduction and various other Marxist economists, centering on the specific relation of arms production to the evolution of the mass and rate of profit under late capitalism. 6. 8 Marx's theory sees the essence of value in abstract social labor, irrespective of the specific use value of the commodity it produces. The existence of some kind of use value is a precondition of the realization of exchange value only in the immediate and obvious sense that nobody buys a good which has absolutely no use for him. But the social fact of purchase is sufficient proof of the use value of a commodity, that is, of its usefulness to its buyer. Hence only unsold commodities do not embody socially necessary labor and thus have no value. Those which are sold are by definition the product of socially necessary labor and increase through their production the mass of socially produced value. D. Capitalism, also by definition, the production of all sold commodities created by wage labor increases the total mass of surplus. 66. Quoted in Luxembourg, The Accumulation o Capital, OPCIT, page 282, 67. Here again, the list of books is too long to be reproduced in full. Leaving aside older works, the following deserve mention. Natalia Moshkovska, Zur Dynamik des Spitkapitalismus, Zurich, New York, 1943. T. N. Vance, The Permanent War Economy, Berkeley, 1970. Adolf Kozlik, Der Vergütungskapitalismus us, Vienna, 1966. Baron and Sweezy, Monopoly Capital, OPCIT. Fritz Wilmar, Rüstung und Abrüstung im Spitkapitalismus, Frankfurt, 1965. Michael Kidron, Western Capitalism Since the War, London, 1968. Of less direct relevance is Gilman, The Falling Rate Zero, Profit, OPCIT, 68. See My Arguments in Late Capitalism, OPCIT, Chapter 9, and those of Kogoy, were Theorie und Staatsausgaben, OPCIT, pp. 165-6. See also Paul Maddock, Kritik der Neomarxisten, Frankfurt, 1974. 54 Introduction value produced and realized, unless they are sold at a price so far below their cost of production that society does not recognize any part of the surplus labor contained in them. In Volume 2, Marx clearly distinguishes production and realization of surplus value, and, by implication, profit, from expanded reproduction of capital, capital accumulation. Not all commodities produced contribute to the process of expanded reproduction. But Marx states quite explicitly that all commodities produced and sold contribute to the increase of total surplus value appropriated by the capitalists and their retainers. 69 By contrast, under conditions of simple reproduction, there would be no surplus value and no profit whatsoever, since all surplus value would be unproductively consumed without entering into the reproduction process. The production of luxury consumer goods, purchased out of the portion of surplus value which is not accumulated, remains within the sphere of the production of value and surplus value, that is to say, it enlarges the mass of profit accruing to the capitalist class. By the same token, the production of arms or space equipment is a form of commodity production. The fact that the sole purchaser is here the state, whereas luxury products are exchanged for revenue of the bourgeoisie, makes no essential difference. In order to determine whether arms production depresses or raises the average rate of profit, the same questions have to be answered as for any other subdepartment of capitalist production. Is the organic composition of capital in that particular department equal, superior, or inferior to the average organic composition in other departments? And does its rise, or fall, influence the average social rate of surplus value? 70 It is not as easy to define the contribution of armaments production to the accumulation of capital as it is to decide whether it constitutes a form of production of value and surplus value which influences the oscillations of the rate of profit. Two basic situations have to be distinguished. 69. See below, pp. 146-9, 178, 508-9 etc. 70. This follows automatically from the commodity nature of the arms produced, that is to say, from the fact that capital invested in that sector is engaged in the production of commodities and the corresponding labor employed in the production of surplus value. Thus, as in the case of the production of luxury goods, differences between the rate of profit within that branch and the rate outside it, due, for instance, to variations in the organic composition of capital, will lower or increase accordingly the social average rate of profit. In Theories of Surplus Value, Marx explicitly defends this position against Ricardo. Introduction 5s In a situation of full employment of capital, which can be, and often has been, accompanied by structural unemployment of wage labor, the production of weapons, like the production of luxury goods not entering into the reproduction of labor power, evidently does not contribute to the accumulation of capital. This is true in a double sense. Weapons, like luxury products, do not provide the objective material elements of expanded reproduction. They furnish neither additional raw materials, machines or sources of energy, nor consumer goods capable of feeding an expanded workforce. Nevertheless, that part of the national income which buys weapons could not have been spent on additional means of production or wages for additional productive workers. Thus, both because of their specific use value, and because they are exchanged against the non-accumulated part of surplus value, weapons do not contribute to expanded reproduction, to capital accumulation, under conditions of full employment of social capital. This does not necessarily imply that weapons production reduces capital accumulation, except in the most general sense that all forms of unproductive expenditure of surplus value do so. For it to be shown that the appearance or expansion of an arms sector has actually reduced expanded reproduction, it would have to be demonstrated that it has appeared, or expanded, at the expense of the sector of means of production. If it has simply replaced luxury production, then, all other things being equal, neither the scope nor the potential rhythm of capital accumulation will have been changed. But what if the weapons sector has appeared, or expanded, at the expense of the sector producing consumer goods for the workers, still assuming full employment of capital? There are again two distinct possibilities to be considered. Where this substitution leads to a decline in the physical or moral working capacity of the labor force, the rate of capital accumulation will fall in consequence, perhaps even, after a certain time, to the extent of contracted reproduction. 71. But where this substitution leaves unchanged the capacity or willingness of the workers to accept the current norm of social labor in the process of production, such a shift of resources from Department II to Department III would imply a rise in the average social rate of surplus value. The same value product would then be produced with the same labor power, but at the cost of less variable capital. The working class would simply receive a smaller share of the existing national income. Whether this would leave 71. See Ernest Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, London, 1968, pp. 332-5, on the war economy. 56. Introduction. The rate of accumulation unaltered, or whether it would actually lead to a higher level of capital accumulation or expanded reproduction, would then depend on the way in which this rise in the rate and mass of surplus value influenced the division of surplus value between the unproductively consumed portion, in which is included the weapons sector, and the accumulated part. 7. 2. At this point, we must abandon the initial supposition of full employment of capital, and examine the actual function of expanding arms production under conditions of long-term plethora of capital. The situation is by no means artificial or introduced purely for the sake of argument. On the contrary, it was already prevalent during the first massive arms drive in the history of capitalism, which took place during the 2 decades preceding the First World War. 73. It was even more marked in the 30s, during the second period of massive rearmament, starting with Japan's Manchurian Incident, and German policy after Hitler came to power, and becoming generalized after 1936. Such plethora of capital remained more than ever the rule in the phase of permanent arming which has lasted now for more than 30 years and shows no signs of coming to an end. Quite the contrary. 74. It is thus entirely appropriate to investigate the effect upon capital accumulation of an armament sector developing under conditions of large-scale plethora of capital. Overproduction of capital signifies, on the value side, the emergence of large sums of capital which have to be hoarded in savings accounts. 72. In the accumulation of capital, OPCIT, pp. 455-7 and 461 feet, Luxemburg correctly stresses the circumstances under which increased military expenditure financed at the expense of the working class, for example, through indirect taxation of consumer goods, may lead to an increase both in the rate of surplus value and in capital accumulation. 73. It is sufficient to refer here to Chapter 8 of Lenin's Imperialism. 74. On the controversy between those who see a current scarcity of capital and those who argue that, on the contrary, there exists a plethora of capital, see Capital Shortage, Fact and Fancy, by the editors of Monthly Review, in Volume 27, Number 11, April 1976. In my own article, Waiting for the Upturn in Procure, Numbers 40-41, December 1975, I put forward the same position as that of Monthly Review. It should be stressed that there is no contradiction between the appearance of a plethora of capital and an actual decline in the rate of profit, i.e. relative scarcity of the mass of surplus value. Indeed, the latter determines the former. This appears paradoxical only to those who, ignoring one of the main lessons of Volume 2, evacuate the time factor from the analysis of capital in general, and mistakenly identify capita J with currently produced surplus value. The prob gem disappears once capital is understood as the accumulation of quantities of surplus value produced in a series of past operations. Introduction. 57 are used for purchasing bonds and government securities, where they beget only the average rate of interest rather than the average rate of profit. On the use value side, it is expressed in sizable stocks of unused raw materials and productive capacity in plant, as well as in large reserves of unemployed workers. If, as RT, dulled of the appearance and expansion of a significant arms sector in the economy, money, or quasi-money, capital is productively reinvested, then the production of value and surplus value increases. We know already that the manufacture of arms is productive of value and surplus value. Hence, in the immediate sense, capital grows richer because more workers are exploited in the production of greater surplus value. Since Department II does not contribute to the creation of the material elements of expanded reproduction, its expansion cannot directly ensure a higher level of capital accumulation, but it can do so indirectly. For as additional workers are employed, the wages bill increases, leading to rising output and sale of consumer goods. Similarly, the consumption of additional raw materials in the weapons industry stimulates the production of mines and other centers of Department I which had previously contracted their output. Material production will rise in all sectors of the economy, thereby augmenting the material elements of expanded reproduction, provided that reserves of productive factors are available. W1 IC follows from the initial hypothesis of underemployment of capital, and or provided that at least part of the additional surplus value is not absorbed by the armament sector or other unproductive departments, but remains available for capital accumulation. These conditions apply with even greater force if the processes described are accompanied by a changed distribution of the national income between wages and surplus value, that is to say, if rearmament is financed to some extent at the expense of the working class through a rise in the rate of surplus value. The Ryu-Eaton combination would then be ideal for the accumulation of capital. At one and the same time, there would occur an expansion of the mass of workers employed and exploited, an expansion of the value product, the mass of surplus value, and market demand, an increase in the rate of surplus value and, probably, the rate of profit, and a rise in the rate of accumulation, an increase of investment in the productive sector, over and above the growth in arms spending. 75-75. This explains the important difference between Hitler's war economy and the post-war boom. In the former case, as opposed to the latter, increased investment was by and large confined to the armaments sector. There occurred no real cumulative growth, involving expansion of the final consumers market. 58. Introduction. Needless to say, this provides no long-term solution to the problems of capitalist equilibrium, since the very success of the operation inevitably reproduces the initial contradictions. Increased capital accumulation leads to a rise in the organic composition of capital, which in turn begins to depress the rate of profit. The higher level of employment, made possible by the absorption of part of the unemployed in the army or the state apparatus, a normal feature of a substantial rise in military spending, reduces the industrial reserve army of labor and thereby, except under a fascist-type dictatorship, tends to make it more difficult to neutralize the effects of the rising organic composition of capital by driving up further the rate of surplus value. A decline in the rate of profit depresses productive investment and leads to both a crisis of overproduction and a fall in the rate of capital accumulation. When that rate actually becomes negative, a process of devalorization of capital begins, which is the normal function of a crisis of overproduction. To counter this new crisis of capital accumulation through an intensification of armaments production, where a sizable sector already exists in the economy, would modify the basic proportions both of the division of surplus value between its accumulated and consumed portions, and of the allocation of productive resources between departments I and II, on the one hand, and department III, on the other. Whatever effect upon the process of expanded reproduction was initially obtained would be increasingly neutralized. Moreover, such a high rate of taxation of profits and wages would be necessary that, except under very special political conditions, the basic social classes, although not that sector of capitalists directly engaged in weapons production and procurement, would revolt against further development of the arms industry. Such an expansion is thus no cure-all for the ills of capitalist overaccumulation and overproduction. But it can trigger off shorter or longer periods of economic upturn as long as those preconditions indicated above are satisfied. 9. How can commercial and financial capital participate in the distribution of social surplus version ELU? The distinction between productive and unproductive labor partially dovetails with the distinction between two general sectors of capital: capital invested in commodity production, be it in industry, agriculture, transport or productive branches of the so-called service industries, and Introduction. 59. Capital invested elsewhere, between productive capital and unproductive capital. The latter category involves essentially commercial capital, banking and insurance capital, and capital invested in the unproductive branches of service industries. We have seen before that, while wage labor hired by these capitalists enables them to appropriate a fraction of the sum total of surplus value accruing to the entire capitalist class, it does not itself add to that total. The question may, therefore, be posed: why do the industrial capitalists, or more precisely all those who invest in the productive sectors, accept that a portion of the surplus value produced by their workers should be appropriated by capitalists whose capital does not contribute to the production of surplus value? This problem is dealt with at length in Capital Volume 3, but since a section of Volume 2 is devoted to it, we should briefly touch on it here. The answer becomes clear once we realize that, although capital invested outside the sphere of material production does not directly augment the mass of surplus value, it does contribute indirectly to its increase. In other words, industrial and farming capitalists abandon a share of their surplus value to traders and bankers not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because these gentlemen help them to raise the mass of that surplus value. In order to demonstrate that this is so, Marx again introduces into his analysis that time dimension, which plays such a key role throughout Volume 2, and which in a certain sense structures the whole process of circulation and turnover of capital. Whereas the total turnover time of fixed capital stretches over many years, and is not basically affected by small shifts in the length of the period during which capital takes the form of commodity capital, during which commodities remain unsold in the sphere of circulation, the situation is entirely different in the case of circulating capital. If it takes 3 months to produce a given mass of commodities, and 3 months to sell them, circulating productive capital will turn over only twice a year unless it receives assistance. That part of it which is exchanged for labor power, and thus makes possible the creation of surplus value, would then remain sterile for 6 months of the year. If, however, commercial capital buys up a large proportion of the commodities as soon as they leave the factory, or if banking capital advances the money to pay the raw materials bill immediately after the commodities are produced and before they are sold, then, owing to the assistance of these sectors of the capitalist class, productive circulating capital can be reinvested as soon 60 introduction as a production cycle is completed. Consequently, variable capital will never remain idle. It will set workers to produce surplus value 12 months, and not 6 months a year. As a result of which, all other things being equal, the total annual mass of surplus value will be twice as great as it would otherwise have been. It naturally pays industrial capital to give a discount to wholesale traders, or to pay interest to bankers, if these rescue operations allow an overall increase in the production of surplus value. What this implies, however, is that only a fraction of total social capital is continuously engaged in production. An important segment remains constantly outside the realm of production. We have already noted why part of social capital necessarily takes the form of money capital. We now see that another portion has to take the form of transportation and banking capital, in order to shorten the circulation time of commodities. From the point of view of the capitalist class as a whole, and this is the one adopted by Marx in Volume 2, only in Volume 3 does he consider these different sectors as competing with one another for fractions of social surplus value. This may be regarded as a functional division of labor within that class. Instead of each industrialist and capitalist farmer acting as his own treasurer, his own money changer, his own transporter, his own seller of commodities on the home and world markets, and his own advancer of additional money capital, all these various functions are socially centralized by sectors of the bourgeoisie specializing in different fields. This division of labor carries with it a considerable rationalization. The costs of overall social circulation, transportation and banking are lower than they would have been if each capitalist firm had had to accomplish these tasks itself. The overhead costs of production are thereby reduced, and the total mass of surplus value is increased through continuous production. It is thus profitable for the bourgeoisie as a whole to maintain, and even expand, as the record of the service industries demonstrates, this functional division of labor. What is the source of capital invested outside the realm of material production? Since all capital derives in the last analysis from surplus value, and since, under the capitalist mode of production, all surplus value is created by productive capital, that is, by wage labor engaged in material production, it may appear that all commercial and banking capital ultimately derives from industrial and agricultural, productive, capital. This is partially true. In Capital Volume 2, Marx points out how money capital is periodically expelled from the process of value. Introduction 61 Production, thereby becoming temporarily available for other purposes. The best example of this is the depreciation fund of fixed capital. Reinvested only at certain intervals, rather than piecemeal after each production cycle, it serves for a time as an important source of money capital employed in credit and other operations. However, such a view should not be generalized. Capital, after all, is older than the capitalist mode of production. Before surplus value was produced in the process of production, vast wealth was accumulated through the plunder of peasants, the fleecing of feudal lords, for example, by overpricing exotic merchandise, robbery of merchants, through piracy, and tribal communities, through the capture of slaves. Merchant, commercial and banking capital existed long before productive capital was born in manufactures, not to speak of the Industrial Revolution. Thus, industrial capital not only reproduces commercial and banking capital by paying over fragments of the surplus value created by its own workers, it also finds these other forms of capital present at the moment of its own birth, and indeed as a condition of this. Commercial and banking capital, then, reproduce themselves both by continuing their former practices, appropriation of part of the social product originating outside the realm of capitalist relations of production, and transformation of it into surplus value and money capital, and by appropriating part of the surplus value created within the capitalist process of production proper. The interpenetration of pre-capitalist, semi-capitalist and capitalist relations of production, imposed upon colonies and semi-colonies by the power of capital on the world market and the violence of foreign political and military domination, has been an extremely important factor in the historical development of these twin sources of money capital accumulation. Through the operations of merchant, commercial, usury and banking capital, they have continued till this very day to play a key role in worldwide capitalist expansion, especially within the so-called Third World countries. Thus pre-innovative accumulation of capital and productive accumulation of capital, through the creation of surplus value in commodity production, are not only successive historical stages, but also simultaneous and combined phenomena. Nor does primitive accumulation automatically lead to a commensurate spread of productive capital and industrialization. It may instead simply condense into a one-sided expansion of the above-mentioned forms of unproductive capital. This circumstance, together with the impact of foreign imperialist domination, clarifies one of the mysteries of underdevelopment under capitalism. 62 Introduction 10. Luxemburg's critique of Marx's reproduction schemas in the history of Marxist thought in the international labor movement. The most important controversy to have arisen in connection with Volume 2 was sparked off by Luxemburg's critique of Marx's reproduction schemas in her The Accumulation of Capital. Involved in the debate have been truly formidable questions: Marx's theory of crisis, the historical limits of the capitalist mode of production, the so-called breakdown theory, or Zusammenbruchs theory, and the origins and functions of imperialism, colonialism, militarism and wars in the imperialist epoch. 76 We shall confine ourselves, in this introduction, to that part of Luxemburg's contribution which is directly related to the subject matter of Capital Volume 2. The circulation, turnover and reproduction of the total social capital. Luxemburg's critique is essentially centered on a single theme: how can that part of the value of commodity which corresponds to the accumulated portion of surplus value be realized? What purchasing power is available for its realization? Why do capitalists expand production, if not because they are assured of, or expect to have, additional customers? Who are these new customers? Schieffer 5T rejects the idea that they could be workers, since the purchasing power of the latter originates with capital, and expansion of production merely to satisfy the new needs of an enlarged workforce would be inconceivable for the capitalist class in its totality. Of course, this is not true of capitalists taken individually, for whom all workers except their own are potential customers. But, as Luxemburg flatly states, for the capitalist class as a whole, all workers are their own workers, and it makes no sense to treat them as a source of increased sales. 77. She also dismisses the notion that these additional customers could be other capitalists. For how could the capitalist class in its totality enrich itself if the money to buy the 76? The main contributions to the discussion on Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital were the reviews by Otto Bauer, in Die Neue Zeit, No. 24, 1913, Anton Pannekoek, in Bremer Bergerzeitung, the 29th of January 1913, and G. Eckstein, in Vorwärts, the 16th of February 1913, and the book by Bukharin, Imperialism and the Accumulation Zero, Capital, op. Cit. Henrik Grossmann, Das Accumulations und Zusammenbruchsgesetz des kapitalistischen Systems, Leipzig, 1929, deals in a number of places with Luxemburg's theory. See also the recent discussion in Arguri Emmanuel, Le Profit et les Crises, Paris, 1975, and Joan Robinson's introduction to the English translation of The Accumulation o Capita, ed. Cit. 77. Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital, op. Cit. pp. 289-90. Introduction 63 Surplus product came out of its own pocket 178 nor could they be so-called third persons, who are essentially the cronies, hangers-on and servants of the capitalist class, or of landowners appropriating ground rent. 4. In the last analysis, the revenue of all these social layers is derived from surplus value. If surplus value were the only source of purchasing power of Jabel for buying up the increased mass and value of commodities, it would mean that capitalists become richer by spending their own money. For Luxemburg, then, the conclusion is inescapable. The additional purchasing power which has to be sucked into the process of capitalist circulation can only come from outside capitalist relations of production properly called, through forcing non-capitalist social classes, essentially peasants and pre-capitalist landowners, ruinously to spend their revenue on capitalist commodities. Only in this way can expanded production and reproduction, capital accumulation and capitalist economic growth in general take place. The end result of the argument is equally obvious. By destroying the non-capitalist milieu on which its expansion is based, capitalism undermines the conditions of its own growth. The disappearance of this non-capitalist, pre-capitalist environment thus marks the absolute limit of capitalist development. 79. While the main thrust of Luxemburg's argument is clear and simple, much of the controversy surrounding the accumulation of capital has been diverted away from her central thesis, largely because she herself combined it with a series of further criticisms of Marx's reproduction schemas which are much easier to answer. Thus, when she asserts that Marx confuses the function of money as means of circulation with the role of income, purchasing power, as necessary prerequisite of the realization of commodity value, she is quite evidently mistaken. 80. And when she implies that the reproduction schemas do not correspond to the reality of the capitalist mode of production, she mixes up levels of abstraction which are clearly differentiated in Marx's method. She is no less misguided when she surmises that, because Marx's figures do not incorporate the laws of motion, of capital, they allow for no increase in the organic composition of capital, they could not incorporate these 78. Ibid. pp. 127-33, 79. The notion that a non-capitalist milieu is necessary for expanded reproduction and accumulation was first advanced by Heinrich Kuhnau, Die Zusammenbruchs Theory, in Die Neue Zeit, No. 1, 1898, and later defended by Karl Kautsky, Krisentheorien, in Die Neue Zeit, No. 2, 1902, and Louis B. Boudin, The Theoretical System of Karl Marx, Chicago, 1907, especially pp. 163-9 and 241-53, 80. Luxemburg, op. Cit. pp. 143-5. Crossing below, pp. 442-4. 64 Introduction Laws. Similarly, it does not follow at all from the evident truth that Department I is the primum movens of the accumulation process, that Department I is somehow sacrificed to, or dependent upon, Department I, in contradiction to the laws of private property and competition. 8. And so on and so forth. On all these secondary issues, controversy has been raging fiercely, generally at Luxemburg's expense. But although it still erupts from time to time, it has little relevance to the principal question that she raised. Luxemburg's main argument has to be answered at three successive levels of abstraction. First, and most abstractly, she committed a methodological error by situating within the framework of capital in its totality, a problem that can only be considered in relation to the competition of many capitals. 82. It is impossible to conduct an analysis simultaneously at these two distinct levels, since capital in its totality abstracts by definition from many capitals, from competition. Thus, the argument that the capitalist class cannot enrich itself by purchasing its own surplus product overlooks the fact that, under a system of private property, the surplus product can never be owned by a single total capital. Capitalist competition implies that capitalists can indeed grow richer by buying one another's surplus product. Marx himself explicitly states that the surplus value created at one point requires the creation of surplus value at another point, for which it may be exchanged. 83. He also indicates that, in the absence of competition, growth would actually disappear. 84. In short, for Marx, growth is possible in a purely capitalist milieu, i.e. where no part of the social surplus product can find non-capitalist customers, provided that the interests and growth rates of all capitalists are assumed to be not identical, but on the contrary rooted in competition. The realization question does not, and cannot, arise within the realm of capital in general. It appears, together with the theory of crises and the trade cycle, only within the sphere of many capitals. This Marx repeatedly stated himself. 85. It follows that reproduction schemas which imply competition should. 81. Schemas incorporating these laws of motion have been worked out by Bauer, Grossman, Leon Sartre, Glembowski, Hosea Jaffe and many others. Whether they assure long-term equilibrium conditions is, of course, quite a different question. 82. This point was first made by Rosdolsky, Op. Cit. pp. 63-72, 83. Grundrisse, Op. Cit. page 407, 84. Capital Volume 3, Chapter 15, 3, 85. Theories of Surplus Value, Op. Cit. Part 2, pp. 532-4. Introduction 65. Assume as a rule the existence of different, rather than equal rates of accumulation in the two departments, only occasionally leading to equalization of the rate of profit. This corresponds to the real modus operandi of the capitalist system. It also points the way to a solution of the technical problems seen by Luxemburg in the fact that the unsaleable portion of commodities of Department II embodies part of the surplus value created in that department. As a matter of fact, Luxemburg dismissed out of hand Marx's convincing solution, which was later developed at length by Otto Bauer. 86. Part of the surplus value produced in Department II is periodically transferred to Department I, precisely when, and because, Department I exhibits, over a considerable length of time, a higher organic composition of capital than that of Department II. At this most abstract level of reasoning, the problem has been posed as one of quasi-static equilibrium. But at a second level which, while still abstract, is a step nearer to the historical reality of the capitalist mode of production, accumulation of capital must be examined as a discontinuous process with a view to understanding its actual dynamics. The first question I posed was the following. Can customers be found for those commodities which embody the accumulated part of surplus value, if we assume that all purchasing power originates as either wages or surplus value within the capitalist process of production itself? Marx's simple answer is yes, so long as we do not take surplus value to be a single mass, owned by a solitary capitalist, who would then obviously be condemned to buy his own goods. The second question may now be reposed as follows. What is the effect upon the realization of the value of commodities embodying the accumulated part of surplus value, JF, and when 1. The organic composition of capital rises in both departments. 2. Department I grows at a faster rate than II, which is the unavoidable result of the rising organic composition of capital, and 3. The rate of profit declines, i.e. the growth in the rate of surplus value is insufficient to compensate for the rising organic composition of capital. In other words, is full realization of surplus value possible when the laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production assert themselves? This second question requires a more complex answer than the previous one. Theoretically, full realization of surplus value is possible, and several ingenious mathematical models have been constructed. By, among others, O. Benedict, Shinzaburo Koshimura, Oscar Lang, J. 86. Luxemburg, Op. Cit. pp. 294-5. 66. Introduction. Caridad Mateo and Hosea J. Aff. 87. In order to show that it is. By contesting this, Luxemburg denied that pure capitalism was possible, thus taking a position exactly opposite to the one which Marx tried to demonstrate with his reproduction schemas. It should be immediately added, however, that the real socio-economic conditions expressed by these algebraic formulas have to be precisely defined. 88. Furthermore, those of her critics who replied that the schemas prove, by themselves, the possibility of unlimited, smooth progress of reproduction. 89. Forgot one small point. Capitalism has been generating periodic crises of overproduction for more than 150 years, and continues to do so with the regularity of a natural law. We can reject out of hand the hypothesis that each successive crisis has been due entirely to specific causes, unrelated to the inner logic of the capitalist mode of production, and extraneous to the interrelation of the growth rates of C, V, S, V, accumulated S, total S, both within and between the two departments. The very periodicity of these crises is enough to refute the harmony theorists, and the view that capital accumulation can go on forever, on the basis of the schemas. In this respect, the superiority of Luxemburg over certain of her critics is obvious. 90. Nevertheless, did she succeed in proving her case in a technically satisfactory manner? We do not believe so, for she narrowed down the problème to an excessively monocausal one. In order to prove that, under capitalism, equilibrium must beget disequilibrium, that expanded. 87. O. Benedict, Die Accumulation des Kapitals bei wachsender organischer Zusammensetzung in unter dem Banner des Marxismus, No. 3, 1929. Koshimura, Op. Cit. J. Caridad Mateo, Repartición del Capital Social, Mexico, 1974. Hosea Jaffe, Processo Capitalista e Teoria dell'Accumulazione, Milan, 1973, and in a personal communication to myself. 88. Let us take a single example. In order to reconcile equilibrium with a rising organic composition of capital and a falling rate of profit, Koshimura has to modify the initial relations between the three departments and to increase considerably the organic composition of Department III, which makes little sense from a historical point of view. Next, he has to lower the total price of production of Department II, workers' wages, to the extent of an absolute decline. Offsetting the falling rate of profit by a rising rate of surplus value, which is plausible, Koshimura arrives at an absolute decrease in workers, and even capitalists' consumption, which is not only implausible but contrary to both Marx's basic assumption in Capital Volume 2, and to the existing empirical data. See Koshimura, Op. Cit. pp. 122-4 and 124-6, 89. See the above-mentioned critique by Eckstein and the article by Helena Deutsch, in Der Kampf, 1913, the Theoretical Journal of Austrian Social Democracy. This is also partially true of the critiques by Bauer and Emanuel. 90. See especially her anti-critique, in Luxemburg and Bukharin, Imperialism and the Accumulation of Capital, Op. Cit. Introduction 67. Reproduction must generate overproduction, and that accumulation of capital must lead to devalorization of capital. It is necessary to bring all the interrelated variables of the reproduction schemas into play. And this she does not do. Thus, while the accumulation of capital raises the correct problems, it does not provide acceptable solutions to them. 91. Synthetically, we may say that the equilibrium formula of expanded reproduction, IV plus I greater than CX plus ISI equals E plus IISJI, implies an identity of the rate of growth of demand for consumer goods generated by Department I, and the rate of growth of constant capital in Department II. Now, the rise in the organic composition of capital entails that the demand for consumer goods generated in Department I will normally grow more slowly than constant capital in that sector, unless the slower rate of growth of variable capital is compensated by a rate of growth of unproductively consumed surplus value higher than that of constant capital, which is extremely unlikely in the long run. The precondition of equilibrium is consequently a rate of growth of constant capital in Department II lower than the one in Department I. If the rates in the two departments are equal, the conditions of equilibrium will be upset. However, a rate of growth of constant capital in Department II which is permanently lower than that in Department I is incompatible with private property and competition. There is no reason why capitalists engaged in the production of consumer goods should forever abstain from trying to incorporate all existing technology, all means of reducing costs of production, all potentially usable machinery. Therefore, IA plus IISJI will from time to time be greater than IV plus ISCX plus ISY, just as, periodically, under conditions of rising organic composition of capital, biased development of labor-saving technology, IA plus ISG, will be equal to AI. E plus ISJI, and AI. E plus ISG, will be greater than LV plus ICX plus is. At 91. Nor can it be accepted that Grossman, Op. Cit., provides these solutions. His own standpoint, a denial that at the bottom of the crisis are problems of realization of surplus value and of disproportionality between production and consumption, is fundamentally unsound. By converting the decline of the rate of profit into the sole cause of the final breakdown of capitalism, he overlooks the fact that this tendency is offset by periodical devalorization of capital. Whereas he seeks to establish a mechanical unity between the theory of crises of overproduction and that of the breakdown of capitalism, the real, dialectical link between the two embodies the following contradiction. Crises of overproduction are the precise mechanism which allows the decline in the rate of profit to be periodically overcome, both through devalorization of the total mass of social capital and through a rise in the rate of surplus value. 68. Introduction therefore seems impossible to avoid periodic overproduction of consumer goods, as well as a decline in the rate of profit and of the ratio ACC, SV, entailing an abrupt halt to the accumulation of capital. Donald Harris has concluded from Marx's assumptions that equilibrium obtains only if, in a value system, there is proportional hiring of labor in the two departments, or if, in a prices of production system, there is an equal ratio of investment. Accumulation of surplus value. 92. However, all these calculations are based upon a misunderstanding of Marx's method. While Marx does assume an equal rate of exploitation in both departments, an assumption based on the concept of an average national value of labor power, for which quite strong empirical evidence exists under developed capitalism, he does not assume either that the organic composition of capital will remain equal or that the rate of surplus value will stay the same. His method of successive approximation to the appearances of day-to-day capitalist economy led him to abstract, at a given stage of the inquiry, from a number of additional variables, in order to clarify certain preliminary problems. This has nothing to do with assuming historical trends. Finally, on the third level, that of the actual historical process of capital accumulation, Luxemburg seems fundamentally correct. Capitalism was born essentially in a non-capitalist milieu. It has immensely enriched itself by plundering that milieu, and the same value transferring metabolism has continued to this very day. Pure capitalism has never existed in real life and, as Engels rightly predicted, it never will exist, because we shall not let it come to that. The Russian October Revolution, and the subsequent expansion of a post-capitalist sector of world economy, indicates that Engels' instinct was a sure one in that respect. Luxemburg's analysis of the ways and means whereby capitalism sucks wealth and value from pre-capitalist communities and classes was an impressive first contribution to 3/4 of a century of anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist world literature. It has still to be equaled in either theoretical insight or economic lucidity. 93. The final balance sheet of Luxemburg's critique, then, must be a nuanced one. We cannot say baldly that she is right or that she is wrong. While many of her partial theses, as well as her final answer, are inadequate, she certainly poses relevant questions and puts her finger on real problems which Volume 2 does not and cannot answer. In particular, 92. Donald J. Harris, on Marx's Scheme of Reproduction and Accumulation, in Journal of Political Economy, Volume 80, 1972, pp. 505 ff. 93. See especially The Accumulation of Capital, chapters 27 to 30. Introduction 69. The contradictory character of capitalist growth, discussion of which was stimulated by her seminal The Accumulation of Capital, cannot be simply subsumed under the formulas, anarchy of production, and disproportionality. Point 94. The specific place which unavoidable disproportions between production and mass consumption occupy in the dynamics of capitalism has to be integrated into any overall explanation of capitalist disequilibrium and crisis. 2. Volume 2 of Capital and Marx's explanation of capitalist crises of overproduction. Our discussion of Luxemburg's critique of Marx's reproduction schemas leads logically on to an examination of his theory of crises, as it appears in Volume 2 of Capital. It is well known that the 4 volumes of Capital which Marx left behind contain no systematic analysis of that key aspect of the capitalist mode of production, the inevitable periodic occurrence of such crises. In his original plan, Marx had reserved a full treatment of the question for a 6th volume dealing with the world market and crises. 9. 5. But partial considerations are interspersed through the text, especially in Volume 4, Theories of Surplus Value, and Volumes 2 and 3. It is on these that we wish to touch briefly here. In Volume 2, Marx makes a number of crucial points about capitalist crises of overproduction. First, he insists upon the fact that the role of commercial capital is intermediary between industrial capitalist and 94. The neo-harmonic IST versions of the Austro-Marxists Hilferding and Bauer were clearly inspired by Tugen-Baranowski's book Studien zur Theorie, OP-CIT. Although both polemicized against Tugen-Baranowski, they fell under the spell of his mathematical juggling with the reproduction schemas. Hilferding's statement in his magnum opus of 1909, Finanzkapital, is especially striking. A general cartel regulating total social production and thereby overcoming crises is, in principle, economically imaginable, even if such a social and political state of affairs is an in one possibility, OP-CIT. Page 372. Bukharin was influenced by the same trend of thought, as clearly emerges from the assertion in Imperialism in the Accumulation Zero, Capital, OP-CIT. Page 226, that under state capitalism, where anarchy of production has been overcome, there could be no crises of overproduction. Drawing on these arguments, Tony Cliff and his disciples have attempted to justify their use of the term state capitalism to define the Soviet economy. An economy which has witnessed no crisis of overproduction for more than half a century. C. Cliff, Russia. A Marxist Analysis, London, 1964, pp. 167-75. For a thorough critique of the neo-harmonic IST interpretation of Capital Volume 2, see Rostolsky, OP-CIT. pp. 569-80 and pp. 586-94. 95. See my Introduction to Capita, Volume 1, OP-CIT. pp. 28-31. 70. Introduction. Final consumer, while helping to shorten the circulation time of commodities and hasten the turnover of productive circulating capital, at the same time masks the growing disproportion between expanding production and lagging final demand. 96. More precisely, Marx adds, the periods in which capitalist production exerts all its forces regularly show themselves to be periods of overproduction, because the limit to the application of the productive powers is not simply the production of value, but also its realization. However, the sale of commodities, the realization of commodity capital, and thus of surplus value, is restricted not by the consumer needs zero society in general, but by the consumer needs of a particular society in which the great majority are always poor and must always remain poor. This, however, belongs rather to the next part. 97. This is but an echo of the famous passage in Volume 3, in which Marx summarizes his theory of crises, ending with the following words. The ultimate reason for all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, in the face of the drive of capitalist production to develop the productive forces as if only the absolute consumption power of society set a limit to them. 9. 8. However, Marx states no less categorically in Volume 2, it is a pure tautology to say that crises are provoked by a lack of effective demand or effective consumption. The capitalist system does not recognize any forms of consumer other than those who can pay, if we exclude the consumption of paupers and swindlers. The fact that commodities are unsaleable means no more than that no effective buyers have been found for them. No consumers, no matter whether the commodities are ultimately sold to meet the needs of productive or individual consumption. If the attempt is made to give this tautology the semblance of greater profundity, by the statement that the working class receives too small a portion of its own product, and that the evil would be remedied if it received a bigger share, if its wages rose, we need only note that crises are always prepared by a period in which wages generally rise, and the working class actually does receive a greater share in the part of the annual product destined for consumption. From the standpoint of these advocates of sound and simple common sense, such periods should rather avert the crisis. It thus appears that capitalist production involves certain conditions, independent of people's good or bad intentions, which permit the relative prosperity of the working class only temporarily, and moreover always as a harbinger of crisis. 9. Is there a 96? See below, pp. 155-6. 97. See below, page 391, note. Our emphasis. 98. Capital Volume 3, Chapter 30, 99. See below, pp. 486-7. Introduction 71. Contradiction between these two explanations? What lies behind the frenetic accusations of underconsumptionism, referred to as some grave deviation or shameful disease, and leveled by some of Marx's followers against others? In our opinion, there is no contradiction whatsoever between the above two sets of comments made by Marx on capitalist crises of overproduction. What he rejects is the common or garden reformist or liberal platitude, according to which crises could be avoided if, in the period immediately preceding or coinciding with the onset of overproduction, the purchasing power in the hands of the masses were to be significantly increased. This simplistic view overlooks two facts. Under capitalism, not all commodities are consumer goods. An important fraction of the total commodity mountain, namely, all means of production, cannot be, and are not intended to be, bought by workers. Therefore, an increase in sales of consumer goods, in and of itself, tells us nothing of the course of sales of equipment and raw materials. It does not lead automatically to greater productive investment. Indeed, a redistribution of the national income at the expense of profits, which would be the outcome of a sudden large rise in wages, would result in a collapse of investment, of sales of means of production. If this succeeded a period of actual decline in the rate of profit, then capital accumulation would contract very violently indeed and the crisis would remain unavoidable. Inasmuch as they forget this basic correlation of the trade cycle with medium-term fluctuations of the rate of profit, all economists, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, who explain the crisis exclusively or mainly in terms of the relation between the purchasing power of consumers and the national income are truly guilty of underconsumptionism, that is to say, of a one-sided and therefore erroneous theory of overproduction in the trade cycle. 10. But the same is true of the opposite theory, which concentrates exclusively or mainly on the disproportion between the two departments, explaining crises by the anarchy of production and the difficulty, impossibility, of establishing the right proportions, spontaneously, as if organized capitalism, or a general cartel, could avoid crisis. 101-100. The most noteworthy Marxist author of this type is Natalia Moshkovska, Zur Kritik moderner Christentheorien, Prague, 1935, but Fritz Stemberg and Paul Sweezy should also be mentioned in this context. The list of non-Marxist economists is very long indeed, running from Simon de Sismondi and Malthus to Lederer and Keynes, 101. See note 94 above. 72. Introduction. Overlooked in such a thesis is the fact, which Marx himself pointed out, 102, that the disproportion between the tendency of unlimited development of the productive forces and the narrow constraints placed upon consumption by the bourgeois mode of distribution, is itself a specific source of disequilibrium, autonomous from the disturbance of equilibrium relations between the two departments. Supporters of this view also forget, like Tugan Baranowski, the father of pure disproportionism, that unlimited growth of Department I leads to ever faster growth of the productive capacity of Department II, although not necessarily in the same proportion. In other words, that under capitalist commodity relations production can never fully emancipate itself from sales to the final consumer. 103. Thus theories of pure disproportionism are as wrong as ones of pure underconsumptionism. The basic causes of periodic crises of overproduction are, at one and the same time, the inevitable periodic decline of the rate of profit, the capitalist anarchy of production, and the impossibility under capitalism of developing mass consumption in correlation with the growth of the productive forces. As we have explained elsewhere. 104. The basic curse of capitalism, the fact that surplus value embodied in commodities can only be realized if they are sold at their value, implies the presence of an insoluble contradiction at a given point of expanded reproduction. Any measure which tries suddenly to reverse the decline of the rate of profit provokes a shrinking of the market of final consumers. And any attempt suddenly to reverse that shrinking accentuates the decline of the rate of profit. Capitalist growth and prosperity require both a rising rate of profit, of currently realized as well as anticipated profits, and an expanding market, as present reality and future trend. But the coincidence of these conditions can never be permanent, for the very forces which bring it into being at a given point in the trade cycle work towards its undoing at a subsequent stage. 10s. In that sense, crises of overproduction are 102. Grundriss, Op. Cit. pp. 420-42. Theories of surplus value, Op. Cit. Pan 3, pp. 120-21. See also Grundriss, page 155, 103. It is quite the same with the demand created by production itself for raw material, semi-finison D goods, machinery, means of communication, and for the auxiliary materials consumed in production, such as dyes, coal, grease, soap, etc. This effective, exchange value positing demand is adequate and sufficient as long as the producers exchange among themselves. Its inadequacy shows itself as soon as the final product encounters its limit in direct and final consumption. Grundriss, page 421, 104. Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Op. dt. Page 370, 105. Among these should be included not only purely economic factors, but also the intertwining of the trade cycle with the partially autonomous cycle of the class struggle. Introduction 73 Unavoidable under capitalism. According to even the most optimistic hypothesis, anti-cyclical policies can only reduce their scope temporarily. They cannot prevent the very moderation obtained during one period from leading, in the long run, to more explosive side effects, such as the cumulative movement of inflation, or the precipitate growth of the burden of company debt. Point 106 The objective logic of crises of overproduction, connected with the operation of the law of value, as clarified by an important remark made by Marx in Capital Volume 2. 107 Equilibrium of the process of expanded reproduction presupposes that commodities are sold at their value, or more precisely, at the value they had at the moment of their production. However, the very dynamic of expanded reproduction involves regular revolutions in technology, unceasing attempts by industrialists to win the competitive struggle by reducing their costs of production and growing substitution of machines for manual labor. All these phenomena, which are translated into regular increases in the average labor productivity of most branches of production, imply a tendency for the value of each commodity to decline. Seen in this light, crises of overproduction are nothing other than objective mechanisms through which the adjustment of market prices to declining commodity values is achieved. Low capital thereby incurs important losses, i.e. devalorizations of capital, whether directly, through the reduction in value of commodity capital, or indirectly, through the bankruptcy and closure of the least efficient firms. Marx further stresses in Capital Volume 2 that there exists a nexus between the trade cycle and the turnover cycle of fixed capital which is distinct from the usually mentioned one of determination grosso modo of the length of the former by that of the latter. Fixed capital expenditure is discontinuous in a double sense. Machines are replaced not piecemeal, except, of course, so far as current repairs are concerned, but in toto, say once every 7 or 10 years. Their replacement tends to occur at the same time in numerous, interconnected key branches of industry, precisely because the process is not only, or even essentially, a function of physical wear and tear, 109, but rather a response to financial incentives, 106. On the roots, functions and consequences of permanent inflation in contemporary capitalism, see Chapter 13 of My Late Capitalism, Op. Cit. 107. See below, page 153, 108. Declining value expressed in gold prices and not, of course, in inflated paper currency, 109. Moral, wearing out of equipment, obsolescence, generally predates physical breakdown under capitalism, given the pressure of competition and accelerated technical progress. 74 Introduction to introduce more advanced technology. The principal criteria of profit calculation are here: availability of sufficient money capital reserves, rising rate of profit and profit expectations, and the existence and/or anticipation of a sudden market expansion. These incentives coincide only at a certain point in the trade cycle, but when this occurs, there follows a massive investment in the renewal of fixed capital. This in turn sets up a dynamic of accelerated capital accumulation and economic growth, together with rapid expansion of markets, which leads finally to an increase in the organic composition of capital, a declining trend of the rate of profit and a tendency to slow down investment and renewal of fixed capital. Discontinuous renewal of fixed capital is, therefore, one of the key determinants of the trade cycle. The difficulty is